welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us on this holiday weekend if you're in the United States, and if you're not, it's great to have you here. We're going to be talking today about power and its uses and abuses in human life, especially as regards authority, dominance, submission, and competition. As you will see from the 2 chapters of ethical wisdom that were sent to you, the history of power in human life is intricate and fascinating and goes all the way back to our evolution from hunter-gatherers to the dawn of agriculture, which brought with it, along with obvious benefits, enormous challenges as well. Now, while this isn't a talk about anthropology, but rather a group of seekers interested in the psychological and spiritual effects of power on the path of awakening, it is interesting and educational to understand a little bit about where we've come from in our evolutionary history in order to gain clarity on what we've inherited, on our basic machinery, both biological and social. So let's take a walk down memory lane. When anatomically modern humans appeared, which was at the end of the Paleolithic period about 200,000 years ago, our hunter-gatherer ancestors grouped together into small-scale bands and societies and made their way from gathering plants and hunting wild animals. In those days before the agricultural evolution, our ancestors' existence was fairly egalitarian, anthropologists tell us. But with the ability to plant, harvest, and store food, humans became hierarchical for the first time. With the ability to trade and make war, dominance became a less avoidable aspect of daily life. Populations increased tenfold in density over that of hunter-gatherer societies. This population explosion led to the formation of tribal groups, which in turn required chiefs or charismatic individuals, generally a big man or occasionally a woman, who functioned as the head of the lineage. With the rise of tribalism, intergroup conflict escalated, as well as the control of labor, which in turn led to hierarchies and classes and power struggle within society. Now, psychologically, this was a quantum change in how we viewed ourselves existentially, because the ability to make seeds grow with predictable results gave rise to an entirely new concept in human life, which was power. Our self-image was altered irrevocably. We became creatures able to dominate the earth. As one psychologist put it, quote, "Man recognized that he could use his will and intention and make things happen instead of things just happening." Within a relatively short period of time, man learned to harness the physical energy of oxen and the energy of the winds. We invented the plow, the wheeled cart, and the sailing boat, and perfected the chemical processes that are involved in the smelting of copper ores. With these major advances, small villages of self-sufficient farmers were transformed into populous city-states, which were then nourished by secondary industries and foreign trade. But with this increase in the size of our human communities and the invention of tillable land, a moral scourge was also introduced to the human race, which was slavery. The land that needed tilling required a great deal of human labor, and this form of need for capital marked a sharp moral plunge. It was the discovery that humans could be used for purely economical purposes, and the resulting introduction of exploitation and slavery. This gave rise to different classes, which was another new phenomenon for human beings, with privileged classes doing the directing and the organizing, claiming and obtaining for themselves, obviously, a disproportionately large part of the product, and a standard of living that the majority of the population couldn't afford. Now, this was more than an uptick in human production. In fact, it created a whole new way of looking at power. With agricultural dominance came a dramatic shift in how humans viewed ourselves. As Erich Fromm put it, quote, No longer the womb, but the mind became the creative power. Man had overcome his inability for natural creation, a formerly female quality. Hear the deep wisdom of that. No longer the womb, but the mind became the creative power. Man had overcome his inability for natural creation, a formerly female quality. And with that switch came the rise of patriarchy and a whole new kind of society which was no longer democratic and egalitarian, but was organized as central, sometimes brutal authority figure. Patriarchy led to the need for conquest and the trespassing of other groups' land and pillaging for profit and power. And, of course, that's led to most of the horrors and the brutality that have characterized a segment of human life ever since. In fact, and this is very interesting, although humans have been aggressive, and we are heirs to what we were talking about last month, the carnivorous psychology of the hunter, it wasn't until the Neolithic period, when agriculture appeared, that men became barbarians. Because, in truth, the more primitive ancestors were far less violent than our species would eventually become. The lower agriculturists, the hunters, and the collectors were the least aggressive, with those who followed becoming increasingly more warlike and power-hungry. That contradicts the outdated picture of human nature as evolving from primitive to civilized, from barbaric to civilized in kind. In fact, it's the other way around. So, that's where we find ourselves as heirs to a so-called civilized world. You and I have inherited a legacy of growing aggression and hierarchy, of dominance and submission, and of the enslavement of certain classes of people. This is so much a part of how we live that we forget, just like fish in water, that power and its evil cousins, greed, aggression, the desire to oppress, comprise the very element in which we move. In spite of whatever religious education we might have received, spiritual values like kindness, equality, and power sharing are very easily trumped by the priorities of a materialist alpha culture. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 forms of power that we utilize and sometimes struggle with in our lives, and how we can harness their positive influence without falling prey to their toxic fallout. The 5 forms of power we'll be talking about are interpersonal power first, artistic power, financial power, sexual power, and spiritual power. So let's begin with interpersonal power and the challenge of relationships. Power dynamics are unavoidable in the dance between egotistical human beings. We all come with a range of possibilities, but gravitate toward different ends of the dominance and submission spectrum. Of course, many people swing between these two extremes and exchange dominance for submission depending on the situation. At the dominance end of things, there are positive and negative manifestations. They range from the charismatic, loving leader who attracts people to him like flies to honey, through example, through love and through moral goodness, all the way to the despot or tyrant who dominates others with force for cruel and selfish reasons. If you move to the other end of our behavioral spectrum, the submissive end, there are also various possibilities, positive and negative possibilities, from the devoted, self-assured, discerning submission of a pupil for a teacher, say, where the pupil's power remains intact, to the other side of things, which is the exploited victim's kind of submission that's robbed of its own autonomy. Okay, this is how I like to think about it. There are 2 extreme poles of power dynamics: extreme dominance and extreme submission. Okay, and these 2 groups represent the positive and the negative wing of the dominant and submission, of the dominant and submissive kinds of human nature. Now, think in terms of submission, the difference between the Sisters of Charity who were doing Mother Teresa's work and the followers of Jonestown who committed mass suicide at the behest of their crazy, self-proclaimed Messiah. Okay. Those are positive and negative forms of submission. Now, they're extreme examples, but in truth, we all oscillate across this panorama of sub-dom possibilities in a dance of energetic exchange that we're very rarely fully aware of. Aside from cases where abuse is happening, none of this is a problem, really. We're social creatures who use power to survive. The only trouble comes when we identify too strongly with one role or the other. Okay? The trouble comes when we identify too strongly with one role or the other, the submissive, the dominant. We mistake ourselves sometimes for our momentary position in relationship, and we forget that the personality playing one up and one down isn't the true self. Okay, this is really the central point. The part of the personality that's playing one up, one down, of the ego, isn't the true self. When you realize this, it creates discernment, and it creates that half-inch of distance between the true self and its power-playing, egotistical side. And that half-inch of distance helps us maintain perspective and not be deceived by our power or mistake ourselves for our power. Because the true self doesn't care about one up or one down. It knows that it's both and neither. When you're rooted in your true identity, you're freed of the illusion that power is a possession or a guarantee. And that freedom makes us paradoxically more powerful, because then we're able to use power for the good of our relationships without making it all about us or attaching power to our own self-worth. Because the ego in relationship uses power to maintain its wobbly self-respect. Okay? It uses power to maintain a shaky self-respect that never lasts for long. Okay? And the reason it doesn't last for long is that this power isn't actually ours, strictly speaking, but belongs instead to the divine force that animates life and moves through us like electricity. Okay, that's the power. We recognize that we're the batteries but not the source. And that knowledge brings with it humility, which in turn increases connection in relationship. People using positive dominance are always aware of this connection. There's a wonderful expression that always reminds me of what positive dominance looks like. The tenderness of wolves. Isn't that great? The tenderness of wolves. All of us can learn to cultivate power without any violence in it, as well as assertiveness that is also gentle. So when it's time to submit, we can take the back seat. We can cede control. We can submit to others. We can be good team players without feeling humiliated or as if we're losing something by being in a supporting role. Relationships, in order to be healthy, require a fair division of power in order for balance to happen. And the ability to give and take, of course, is critical. When you remember that the power isn't you, you're able to do this dance more gracefully. So ask yourself, what is your relationship to power in relationship? Are there certain kinds of relationship where you feel the need to be in control, for instance, where you prefer to be dominant, or are there others where you would much rather be submissive to follow the dominant other? Are you someone who fixates on power and where you stand in the pecking order? Do you mistake yourself for the seesaw itself? These are great questions to explore. Because power in relationship can make or break intimacy, as we all know. And most of us go through our lives not understanding how we're using dominance and submission in positive and negative ways. Now, I'm going to be sending you a toolkit of practices to your inbox tomorrow for each of these 5 forms of power that can help in untangling the knots that you get into. So tomorrow you'll be getting a toolkit of practices around today's talk. Next, we move to artistic power and the ability to feel like a creator in your own life. Whether you are an artist in a creative medium, such as painting or writing or something like that, artistic power, or an artist in another field of life, artistic power infuses life with a curious eye and a passionate heart. There are mother artists, there are doctor artists, there are waitress artists, there are retired life artists, all of whom recognize the power at their disposal to engage, inspire, and elevate through the example of their own enthusiasm. Remember, the word enthusiasm means filled with God. Artists, the artistic power, brings brio and verve to life, and also craft and freedom. Because, as Plato called it, techno to biou, the craft of living. Artists bring the craft of living to their existence. And part of being a good craftsman is understanding your own materials and making them a part of you. So an artist of life spends a good deal of time paying attention to what they have, concentrating their intention on it, and learning how to use it skillfully. Artistic power brings a person to life in a more engaged and transformative way, because artists see life as evolution and recognize the vitality at the heart of things. Now, artistic power applies, of course, to relationships as well, because relationships require a great deal of skill as well as the willingness to imagine, especially when things get tough. To imagine our way toward forgiveness, toward acceptance, toward surrendering ego when necessary, is part of the art of loving. It's part of the transformation of me to we. This transformation from me to we is an act of the imagination, and love is the highest kind of art. So ask yourself, do you bring the artistic power of curiosity to your own life, of devotion, of imagination? And if so, are there parts of your life where you don't bring artistic power and that might be suffering? Do you view your life as an evolution or a devolution, as a new life every day or as a dwindling of the past toward the future? Ask yourself, how can you bring more inventiveness and curiosity to your day-to-day existence, and creativity in what may be possible if you allow yourself to stay interested? Because that's the key to artistic power, interest. And where interest lapses, we're wise to pay close attention, because ambivalence is like kryptonite to self-growth. The artistic spirit is never ambivalent. It may be tortured, it may be confused, bemused, filled with longing, but it's never ambivalent. So take a look at your own truth in your own life. Do you have ambivalent patches, places where you feel yourself going dead, looking away, closing down, blurring over, feeling paralyzed? Those are the very places where you're losing power because you have disengaged. Next, we move to economic power. And, maybe it seems strange putting economic power in this top 5 list in a group about spiritual seeking. But money and its metaphors are too universally influential not to look at carefully. Now, on a personal level, economic power can feel tantamount to the right to survive, especially in a capitalist culture. There's a wide belief among certain people in our capitalist culture that the poor and the disenfranchised, even some of the afflicted, are layabouts who are looking for an easy handout. From a greedy, competitive eye, human need looks like exploitation, and compassion can look like being played for a fool. In fact, it's nearly impossible in a capitalist culture not to see oneself and one's personal power through a socioeconomic lens. And that prompts us to mistake ourselves for what we have, and to mistake cash for love and for genuine self-worth. When you see money as love and its absence as hate, as life turning against you, then you can enter a cycle, a vicious cycle of self-criticism and lack of upward mobility, for want of a better word. And I don't mean that upward in the sense of above other people, but upward in the sense of our own evolution, economically, financially, being able to take care of ourselves. Now, I grew up poor, so I know what it feels like to be outside the margins of normal life, so-called, at the far end of the wrong side of the tracks. And I know that it's not just the absence of money that robs you of power. It's the position that you're forced to play. This role of being a have-not, of being a welfare person, of being someone who doesn't deserve the best. That's the actual humiliation. Not being broke, but being poor. It's like the difference between guilt and shame. We feel guilty for stealing, but shame for being a thief. And it's the same with economic power. Okay. Making money is only one part of healing low self-esteem based on lack of economic power. Okay. It's equally important that we lose the label of being poor that we carry around inside us. Because if we see ourselves as poor, we remain poor regardless of how economically successful we might be. You've probably known well-to-do people who have a poverty mentality. You know, they're living high on the hog, but they might as well be eating out of a dumpster. I can't tell you in my own life how many middle-class women, and even some rich ones, have told me about their greatest fear being that they're going to end up as a bag lady. Okay. Now, that metaphor of the bag lady comes from feeling poor, not broke. Okay. And we need to address this economic dysmorphia, this distortion in how we see ourselves, if we hope to maintain our balance and a clear hold on reality. Otherwise, if we're driven by this poverty mentality, this idea of power, of financial powerlessness, it's very easy to become slaves to the man, to become a rat on the wheel, even when the wheel is made of platinum. So ask yourself, do you see yourself and your own value through an economic lens? Are you someone who feels poor even though you're not poor, or rich even though you don't have money? Because there are lots of folks who feel plenty of power when it comes to their economics, even though they don't have any money, because they see themselves as rich. Are you someone who equates money with love? And if so, how and when and with whom? Does your self-worth depend on what you're earning? Or do you recognize that you are enough, regardless of how much you have in the bank? Okay, regardless of your financial circumstances. Do you recognize that you are enough? That's the foundation of an awakened attitude toward monetary life and toward all the effort that goes into supporting ourselves and surviving in this difficult world. Now let's move on to sexual power. Okay. The realm of sexual power is a kind of a shadow zone of trick mirrors, of surprising desires. It's a secret part of human interaction where fantasies of power and powerlessness are often used to satisfy psychological needs and desires that have no outlet in ordinary life, through imagination or otherwise. Power is elusive and mysterious in sexual relations, and the drives that fuel sexual desire can range from the sublime to the ridiculous, to the reprehensible. Let's go back to our dominance and submission spectrum and the positive, negative manifestations of both. Okay. Even Tantra, the most spiritual of sexual practices, depends on a dominant and submissive party. Depends on active and passive, a pistol and a stamen, a pitcher and a catcher, a balancing of yin and yang. This attraction to balance and of opposites exists in nearly all living things with bodies that want to connect to each other. Okay? We're born with shapes and needs and predispositions and the capacity for erotic communion. and changing places and enjoying difference in our erotic lives. The trouble comes when sexual partners get stuck in their roles and neurotic attachment to their designated position, when they use sexual power either to dominate others in unhealthy ways or to subjugate themselves to predatory types who exploit their need to give themselves to be controlled. When this happens, partners lose that half-inch of space between the true self and the role they're playing. They lose what you could call their sexual discernment. And at the same time, they lose their ability to connect with one another. Okay? When you lose your discernment, you lose the ability to connect authentically. When you lose your when you lose that half-inch of distance between the true self and the role you're playing, you also sacrifice the ability to connect deeply. Now, the good news is that sexual power can be freed of this tendency toward abuse or being abused when the ego isn't calling it the shots. In fact, sexual power can be used to deepen love and connection. Lovers can learn to play one another like instruments with many strings and to appreciate the full range of music that exists between them. We recognize sexual power as something to be shared and cultivated and freed in order to bring added delight and spice to our lives. So, if you're someone who tends to be dominant, much can be learned through trust and surrender. And if you're someone who tends to be submissive, much can be learned from taking control and for asking for what you want. So, how do you feel in your own life about sexual power? Do you believe that it depends on the body that you happen to have? Or do you recognize sexual power as your very essence, the actual blueprint of your personality, a kind of a template for how you love? Remember what Sigmund Freud said. He said, quote, "The behavior of a human being in sexual matters is often a prototype for the whole of his other modes of reaction in life." Let me repeat that. The behavior of human beings in sexual matters is often a prototype for the whole of his other modes of reaction in life. Okay. So how is that reflected in your own life? Do you feel disempowered or empowered sexually? What does that depend upon? Okay. How do you feel disempowered when you feel vulnerable? Do you feel powerful when you feel unseen? Or rather anonymous? Is that something that fills you with power? As we were talking about last month with the Mardi Gras effect. Okay. There are people who can only feel powerful in a sexual realm when they're impersonating somebody else. So where do you fall in the zone of sexual power? How are you able to access it and use it? Okay, in positive or negative ways, or both? These are great questions to ask on the path. And finally, we come to spiritual power. Spiritual power is the most embracing and pervasive power of all, of course. All of these forms of power we've been talking about partake of spiritual power. Technically, there is no power that's not spiritual. But for our purposes today, I'm referring specifically to power that comes from spiritual practice, from spiritual wisdom, from a spiritual worldview. The purpose of spiritual practice, of course, is to set us free by knowing the truth, which in turn reminds us that we're all endowed with the one true power every minute of every day when we remember our true nature. Okay, that's the purpose of all spiritual power, to set us free by knowing the truth. And the truth is that we're all endowed with the one true power all the time, when we remember our authentic self. In fact, you and I are nothing but power, spiritual power, being channeled through a gross material form. Our core, that power, is awake, it's intelligent, it's bright, it's charged with electricity. Okay? And that electricity arises from the source of being itself. when we know ourselves for what we are, which is, it opens the door to spiritual power. Okay? And spiritual power, again, can be used in dominant or submissive ways that are both positive and negative. Unlike the other four types of power, though, spiritual power refers to the unseen world, and it can't be proved one way or the other, which is why the world is filled with false prophets and charlatans and corrupt gurus and raping priests, all manner of spiritual exploitation. When you combine the agenda of a person abusing spiritual power with the desperate need of a follower to be told what to do, you have a kind of a Molotov cocktail of dharmic proportions. The great spiritual teacher Meher Baba reminded us that there's no more reprehensible individual than the corrupt guru. Okay? Because the corrupt guru preys on us at our most vulnerable place. There's an excellent essay of Meher Baba's called Spiritual Jingoism that I'd like to read just a short bit from, because it captures what we're talking about. He says, quote, "The whole world is pining for light and freedom. To meet this recurrent and poignant demand, there always arises a plentiful supply of those who claim to meet it adequately. Most of these claimants are impostors," says Meher Baba. "The temptation to seize the ideal imaginatively and then pose as having realized it is so irresistible that there are very few who do not succumb to it. This is the origin," he says, "of the fraudulent saint or the spiritual jingo, who walks and talks with his nose in the air and arms akimbo as if he were somebody very special." Now, we've all known these people who use spiritual power for their own ends, so-called spiritual power, because, of course, we can't prove that they have it. They exploit us in our most tender, sacred part. Negative spiritual figures who are dominant. They exploit us in our most tender parts, and they can wreak havoc on our awakening selves on the path, and create distrust instead of empowerment. On the other side of the dominant spiritual spectrum are the positive figures, the spiritual giants, the Buddhas, the Jesuses, the Ramakrishnas, the Eckhart Tolles, the Mother Miras. Okay? These spiritual giants are capable of pointing multitudes of souls toward enlightenment. But this can only happen when the ego isn't in play. Okay? When spiritual power is co-opted by the egotistical self, it becomes counterfeit, it becomes self-serving, and it even becomes, as we saw with Jim Jones, evil. Look at the Christian Crusades, when the church slayed hundreds of thousands of people in defense of their own spiritual power. Okay? So it's not just individuals, it can be institutions. On the other side of the spectrum, when it comes to spiritual submission, the dangers are obvious, as we've just said. But on the positive side of spiritual submission, we come to devotion. Devotion, or bhakti, is one of the primary paths of yoga. And it's a steep path, especially for people who aren't given to authority or to outward shows of devotion. Because true devotion, of course, is an inward state, and it's a mystery. It's beautiful, but it's also daunting to behold. To give oneself so totally to love in the form of God or Guru or Buddha mind. To serve with selfless, unstinting devotion. Not to get brownie points in heaven, but because you need to, you long to, is a form of grace. Okay? True devotion is like the plant that bends toward the sun in order to feed its deepest hunger. It's that kind of surrender. Spiritual devotion also doesn't need to be to a religious figure. Okay? Every parent knows that. Most parents know that, I should say, who are full of love for their children. Children teach us spiritual lessons such as selflessness and tolerance and faith. In fact, it takes a whole lot of faith to get through raising a kid. That's how children become our teachers. They become our gurus in love. It's how, as the Bible says, the child becomes father to the man, by reminding us of our own innocence. The exchange of love and innocence between a parent and child may be the most sacred exchange of all. It's certainly at the very heart of spiritual power, when me really does become we through the body. Devotion is a path of strength, not weakness. And especially when the going gets rough. Okay. When surrender brings challenges and the ego most wants to run away. Okay, that's when love is forged most profoundly. Thomas Merton wrote, quote, "Prayer and love are learned in the hour when prayer becomes impossible and the heart has turned to stone." Prayer and love are learned in the hour when prayer becomes impossible and the heart is turned to stone. On the path of devotion, this is bound to happen. Okay? The heart will turn to stone, prayer will become impossible, devotion will seem out of reach. Yet, it's in the very act of staying, of abiding, of trusting, of resisting the urge to run away, that spiritual power takes hold of us. So ask yourself, how do you feel about spiritual power? Are you someone who's drawn to spiritual authority, or are you guru-phobic? Are you someone who revels in spiritual power yourself, your own spiritual power? And if so, how do you channel that power? Is there any exploitation in your approach, or do you recognize the power as not being yours? Do you recognize it as not being yours, and do you respect spiritual power coming through you as you would respect a gift or a promise? And what about spiritual submission or surrender? Are you someone who's able to be humble before a great teacher? Are you able to be discerning but also devoted? Or do you throw discernment out the window and give your devotion to every seeming sage or teacher who comes your way? That can be very, very self-destructive and completely disempowering. So these are important questions to ask ourselves on the spiritual path. How do we use our own power? What kind of power are we attracted to? Are we able to be humble before love, which is to open ourselves to the greatest spiritual power? Or does fear or vanity, insecurity prevent us from opening our hearts and keep us in avoidance of devotion, which is one of the supreme pleasures of human life?